Michelle Mockbee went to work early in the morning. An hour after her arrival, her colleagues made a horrific discovery. In this first case, we delve into the tragic end of this young woman, as well as the capture of the perpetrator on surveillance cameras. Additionally, we explore the life story of the Pyne family and the calamity that befell their home. Brace yourselves. We're stepping into the crime scene now. Michelle Mockbee lived in America and worked as an accountant at Thermo Fisher Scientific for 16 years. She met her husband, Dan Mockbee, at a Christmas party. They fell in love and had 2 daughters, Madeline and Carly. Michelle loved spending time with her family and friends. On May 29, 2012, Michelle started her workday at 6 in the morning. Michelle did payroll every 2 weeks. The payroll was processed on Mondays. To make sure everything was ready and sent to headquarters on time, she began her work in the morning. An hour later, a coworker came to Michelle's door and saw a strange stain that looked like blood on the carpet. They tried to enter her office, but the door was locked. The coworker asked the janitor for help, and they looked for the source of the blood. A terrifying sight unfolded when coworkers discovered a stain outside her office, leading them to believe that Michelle had been attacked and possibly kidnapped there. Her body was face down, located a short distance from her office, about 40 meters away, with blood trails scattered between the 2 locations. The boss called the police and reported what he saw.
And I just walked in her office and I think somebody had killed somebody upstairs in her office.
Okay. What makes you think somebody killed somebody?
She's laying there on the ground, covered up, and there's blood all over the floor in the office.
Okay. Is it somebody?
The police responded quickly to the scene and started their investigation. Given the evidence, it was believed that Michelle had been attacked and possibly kidnapped right outside her office. Despite the locked office door, there were traces of a violent break-in on the doorknob. After being informed of the situation by his colleagues, Dan hurried to the workplace. The police informed him of Michelle's death and gave their condolences. They then questioned Dan about where he was that morning, to which he explained he had the day off and was sleeping in bed. Due to the severity of the incident, Dan underwent a lie detector test and successfully passed it. The police found out that on the morning of the killing, 13 workers were at the workplace. They were all taken to the police station for questioning, but none of them seemed to have anything to do with the killing. Although the offices and warehouses were well protected, the police began to suspect that the attacker might have found an unnoticed way to enter that morning. Despite searching, they couldn't find the murder weapon or any clothes stained with blood. Given the absence of the murder weapon or blood-stained clothes at the scene, the police began to speculate that these items might have been disposed of earlier that morning. They looked at the surveillance footage and saw a delivery truck leave at 6:30 a.m. and come back 30 minutes later. The truck belonged to David Dulé, the janitor at Thermo Fisher, who had been working there for a while. The officers talked to him and asked it why he left early. David said he left early to check on his wife, citing her health problems as the reason. The police talked to David's wife, Janet, who said that he came back home to change his ripped pants, not to see her. Because of this, the police became suspicious of David's statements and questioned him again. He said that he didn't come home in the morning or change his pants. Later, Janet revised her statement and said she saw the ripped pants in the apartment when she woke up. She thought maybe that's why her husband came back. The police came up with some theories after hearing this. According to them, David wanted to break into Michelle's office the morning she was killed. The reason was related to payroll because they found some issues in the records. It was discovered that both David and his wife were employed at the same place, and there were anomalies in their payroll records, suggesting that they earned triple the salary on occasions when only one of them was actually working. They falsified their timesheets to make more money. Michelle didn't realize this for a while. It was theorized that a confrontation might have occurred between David and Michelle at the office on the day of the murder, ultimately leading to the tragic incident. Michelle Mockbee's autopsy report showed that she had suffered from 4 significant blows to her head, and her arm was broken. She sustained multiple hits, which ultimately proved fatal, but not immediately. First, the strikes cracked her skull, causing critical brain damage. The severity of the assault was evident from her critical injuries. The doctor attributed the arm fracture to her body being dragged. David Dooley faced charges of murder, kidnapping, and evidence tampering, according to police. The prosecution claimed that Michelle discovered the incident and threatened to expose David, prompting him to commit the crime. In court, David and Janet's defense attorneys argued that their clients were paid a fixed rate for cleaning the office, which they claimed was misinterpreted as being triple their actual salary, and emphasized that no falsification occurred. The prosecutor stated that they didn't discover any items that could be identified as the murder weapon or clothing with bloodstains. Consequently, they believed that someone had taken them away from the office. The prosecutor's suspicion was particularly directed towards David Dooley, notably as he was the only employee seen leaving the office early that morning. The security footage showed that David was supposed to wear steel-toed shoes while cleaning the office. However, that day, he wore sneakers. David Dooley was found guilty of murder and tampering with evidence. He was given a life sentence for murder and 5 years for evidence tampering. During his sentencing, David voiced his concerns, stating that he felt the process was unfair and that he hadn't been given a fair chance to fully defend himself while maintaining his innocence. Nevertheless, David's verdict was immediately reversed, and a new trial was demanded. 2 years after David's trial, investigators found incriminating evidence on the computer of prosecutor Linda Talley Smith, who handled David's case. They gave it to the Kentucky prosecution team, and it revealed an unshared USB drive containing old security video footage. The footage captured someone trying to break into the building only 10 hours before Michelle was killed. The judge determined that the recordings, which allegedly included an unidentified person, constituted essential evidence that hadn't been provided to the defense. The prosecution displayed the same proof as in the first hearing, though the defense had a better tactic now. They claimed that the accusation against David wasn't substantial. Instead, they accused the person in the recordings of committing Michelle's murder. The defense suggested the possibility that Dan, motivated by a substantial life insurance payout, might have hired someone to kill Michelle. They claimed that after Michelle's death, Dan received a $700,000 life insurance payout. While the defense recognized Dan's receipt of a substantial life insurance payout, they particularly focused on a specific, suspicious payment made to Chris Black. They found out that Dan gave his friend Chris Black a $10,000 check. Chris, a co-worker at Thermo Fisher Scientific, was also a friend of both Dan and Michelle. The defense asked Dan why he gave Chris the money, but Dan couldn't remember and denied any connection to the murder. The defense team raised suspicions about Dan's potential motives, suggesting he might have had reasons to orchestrate the murder, possibly even hearing someone for the act. The defense raised the possibility that Joe Siegert, an employee at the company, could have been implicated in the crime, potentially as a hired assailant. On the day of the killing, the police interviewed Joe, who said he saw Michelle and David. The defense argued that Joe's statements on that day were inconsistent. Joe Siegert first claimed that unloading a delivery van took him 40 minutes, but later revised his statement to 20 minutes, a change that raised questions during the trial. The defense argued that this time gap was long enough to commit murder. They also informed the jury that a significant amount of blood was present in the office, but none was discovered in David's delivery truck during the searches. Deanna Dennison, the defense lawyer, underscored in her final statement the importance of reasonable doubt, arguing that the real question isn't simply if David could have or probably did it, it's whether the prosecution has successfully eliminated reasonable doubt. The prosecutor argued that there was enough proof and too many coincidences. Despite the defense team's vigorous efforts, they were unable to sway the jury, resulting in David Dooley being found guilty again and receiving a 38-year prison sentence. Before we dive into our next story, if you could take a moment to hit that like button, it would mean the world to us. A single click for you is a huge boost of encouragement for us. Ruth Ann Hawk was born in Detroit on November 26, 1959. She went to Lyon High School where she met Bernie Pyne. At first, Ruth had a crush on Bernie, but he turned her down. However, Ruth persisted, and eventually Bernie reciprocated her feelings. They began dating and fell in love. They got married on February 20th, 1979, when they were just 19 years old. Ruth worked as a dental assistant, and Bernie was an automotive engineer. They often took part in events at their nearby church. Jeffrey, their son, was born in 1989. In 1999, their family was complete when Julia, their daughter, was born. Following the birth of her children, Ruth chose to leave her job as a dental assistant and become a full-time homemaker. Ruth was a loving mother who cared for her children and enjoyed crafting and spending time with her family. However, after Julia was born, Ruth's behavior changed and concerned her husband Bernie. He worried that women in their church were trying to seduce him. Bernie became more worried about Ruth's paranoia and took her for a medical examination. Eventually, Ruth was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at a young age, confirming her husband's concerns. She began taking medication which helped her condition. Unfortunately, Ruth did not always stick to her medication schedule. Stopping her medication on her own was dangerous, affecting both her and her family. Stopping the drug caused serious attacks, psychosis, worsening of the disease, and dire consequences. Ruth was hospitalized multiple times for her mental health issues. In 2010, Ruth was arrested for attacking her son Jeff, but the charges were later dropped after she agreed to a condition that she resume her medication regimen. Despite these challenges, Jeff was a good student with no behavior problems. He studied biology at the University of Michigan, motivated in part by a hope to better understand his mother's illness. That same year, struggling with Ruth's mental illness, Bernie sought comfort in a relationship with another woman. This eventually led to his decision to divorce Ruth, leaving her to confront her challenges on her own. Ruth begged Bernie not to leave, feeling desperate and afraid of facing her challenges alone. She begged him to stay and promised to take her medication and fulfill her marital duties. Bernie, who still loved Ruth, agreed to stay, and she started taking her medication. On May 27, 2011, Bernie and their daughter Julia returned home at 3:15 p.m. They planned on going swimming, so Bernie remained outside to turn on the pool pump. Julia attempted to enter the garage but let out a scream. Bernie rushed over and discovered Ruth's body in the garage. He promptly dialed 911. Ruth had been assaulted and stabbed multiple times in the neck, indicating a brutal attack. The defensive wounds on her body and a broken skull indicated that she had fought back during the attack. The police, considering the locked and bolted front door along with other evidence, ruled out the possibility of a random attack. Ruth was found bloody beside the garage door, but there was no blood beneath it. It appeared that the perpetrator entered through the front door and had a means to lock it from the outside upon exiting. Upon inspection, only a drop of blood was discovered in the sink, indicating that the perpetrator cleaned the interior of the house. There was no proof to determine who killed Ruth, but the authorities suspected her spouse, Bernie. He took a lie detector test and passed it. Bernie confessed to engaging in extramarital affairs and stated that Ruth was aware of them. He insisted that he did not murder Ruth and stated he had an alibi for the time of the murder, between noon and 2 p.m. Following that, the investigators shifted their focus to Jeffrey, questioning him about the day of the murder. Jeffrey claimed to have an alibi for the time of the murder. He said he called a neighbor on the day in question and went to their house to plant bushes and do some gardening. The police went to the neighbor's house, but they were out of town and not home. Upon further inquiry, the police learned from the neighbor that the gardening had been completed a few days earlier, which contradicted Jeffrey's claim of being there on the day of the murder. Still, Jeffrey claimed he had been there and provided a voicemail message as proof, which was discovered on the neighbor's landline phone.
Yeah, this is Jeffrey. I've been over to your house a few times since I thought you were coming home.
Jeffrey said he would come to do the gardening in an hour. Later, he went to work at 3 o'clock after finishing his tasks. He said his mother was sleeping peacefully in her bed when he left and everything was fine. As the investigation continued and inconsistencies in his alibi became apparent, the police began to suspect Jeffrey Pyne, eventually accusing him of first-degree murder of his mother. This shocked the entire family. Jeff's father, Bernie, and sister Julia claimed Jeff could not have committed the crime. They said Ruth was in good health before she died. In court, they backed Jeff and named someone else he used to be friends with as a possible culprit, alleging that this individual had previously known Ruth while she was at a mental health clinic. A neighbor said they saw a man in a yellow hoodie in their yard a few days before the murder. While the trial presented evidence against Jeff, this evidence was viewed as weak and insufficient by many observers. Jeff's ex-girlfriend claimed he was frustrated with his mother, a feeling intensified by his psychological struggles and desire to move out, yet he also feared the impact of leaving on Julia and his mom. Additionally, a bloodstain was discovered in Ruth's sink, leading prosecutors to argue that it indicated efforts to clean up after the crime. However, no additional evidence, such as traces of blood or bloody clothing, was discovered. The defense contended that since Ruth had lived in the house for 30 years, the presence of a single drop of blood was not definitive proof of Jeff's guilt, suggesting it could have been unrelated to the crime. Ultimately, the jury convicted Jeff of Ruth Pyne's murder. This verdict left Bernie and Julia emotionally distressed, as they believed Jeff's conviction was unjust. Jeff Pyne was imprisoned in Ionia and given a 60-year sentence. His appeal in 2015 was denied, and currently he remains in prison.